Section 31. Being there as understanding. State of mind is one of the existential structures in which the being of the there maintains itself. Equiprimordial with it in constituting this being is understanding. A state of mind always has its understanding, even if it merely keeps it suppressed. Understanding always has its mood. If we interpret understanding as a fundamental existentiale, existential thing, this indicates that this phenomenon is conceived as a basic mode of Dasein's being. On the other hand, understanding, in the sense of one possible kind of cognizing among others, as distinguished, for instance, from explaining, must, like explaining, be interpreted as an existential derivative of that primary understanding which is one of the constituents of the being of the there in general. We have, after all, already come up against this primordial understanding in our previous investigations, though we did not allow it to be included explicitly in the theme under discussion. To say that in existing Dasein is its there is equivalent to saying that the world is there. Its being there is being in, and the latter is likewise there as that for the sake of which Dasein is. In the for the sake of which, existing being in the world is disclosed as such, and this disclosedness we have called understanding. In the understanding of the for the sake of which, the significance which is grounded therein is disclosed along with it. The disclosedness of understanding as the disclosedness of the for the sake of which, and of significance equiprimordially, pertains to the entirety of being in the world. Significance is that on the basis of which the world is disclosed as such. To say that for the sake of which and significance are both disclosed in Dasein means that Dasein is that entity which, as being in the world, is an issue for itself. When we are talking ontically, we sometimes use the expression understanding something, with the signification of being able to manage something, be a match for it, being competent to do something. In understanding as an existentiale, that which we have such competence over is not a what, but being as existing. The kind of being which Dasein has, as potentiality for being, lies existentially in understanding. Dasein is not something present at hand, which possesses its competence for something by way of an extra. It is primarily being possible. Dasein is, in every case, what it can be, and in the way in which it is, its possibility. The being possible which is essential for Dasein pertains to the ways of its solicitude for others and of its concern with the world, as we have characterized them. And in all these, and always, it pertains to Dasein's potentiality for being towards itself, for the sake of itself. The being possible, which Dasein is existentially in every case, is to be sharply distinguished both from empty logical possibility and from the contingency of something present at hand, so far as with the present at hand this or that can come to pass. As a modal category of presence at hand, possibility signifies what is not yet actual and what is not at any time necessary. It characterizes the merely possible. Ontologically, it is on a lower level than actuality and necessity. On the other hand, possibility as an existentiale is the most primordial and ultimate positive way in which Dasein is characterized ontologically. As with existentiality in general, we can, in the first instance, only prepare for the problem of possibility. The phenomenal basis for seeing it at all is provided by the understanding as a disclosive potentiality for being. Possibility as an existentiale does not signify a free-floating potentiality for being in the sense of the liberty of indifference, libertas indifferentiae. In every case, Dasein, as essentially having a state of mind, has already got itself into definite possibilities. As the potentiality for being which is, it has let such possibilities pass by. It is constantly waiving the possibilities of its being, or else it seizes upon them and makes mistakes. But this means that Dasein is being possible, which has been delivered over to itself, thrown possibility through and through. Dasein is the possibility of being free for its ownmost potentiality for being. Its being possible is transparent to itself in different possible ways and degrees. Understanding is the being of such potentiality for being, which is never something still outstanding, as not yet present at hand, but which, as something which is essentially never present at hand, is, with the being of Dasein, in the sense of existence. Dasein is such that in every case it is understood, or alternatively not understood, that it is to be thus or thus. As such understanding, it knows what it is capable of, that is, what its potentiality for being is capable of. This knowing does not first arise from an immanent self-perception, but belongs to the being of the there, which is essentially understanding. And only because Dasein in understanding is its there, can it go astray and fail to recognize itself. And insofar as understanding is accompanied by state of mind, and as such is existentially surrendered to thrownness, Dasein has in every case already gone astray and failed to recognize itself. In its potentiality for being, it is therefore delivered over to the possibility of first finding itself again in its possibilities. Understanding is the existential being of Dasein's own potentiality for being, and it is so in such a way that this being discloses in itself what its being is capable of. We must grasp the structure of this existentiale more precisely. As a disclosure, understanding always pertains to the whole basic state of being in the world. As a potentiality for being, any being in is a potentiality for being in the world. Not only is the world qua, world, disclosed as possible significance, but when that which is within the world is itself freed, this entity is freed for its own possibilities. That which is ready to hand is discovered as such in its serviceability, its usability, and its detrimentality. The totality of involvements is revealed as the categorial whole of a possible interconnection of the ready to hand. But even the unity of the manifold, present at hand, of nature, can be discovered only if a possibility of it has been disclosed. Is it accidental that the question about the being of nature aims at the conditions of its possibility? On what is such an inquiry based? When confronted with this inquiry, we cannot leave aside the question, why are entities which are not of the character of Dasein understood in their being, if they are disclosed in accordance with the conditions of their possibility? Kant presupposes something of the sort, perhaps rightly, but this presupposition itself is something that cannot be left without demonstrating how it is justified. Why does the understanding, whatever may be the essential dimensions of that which can be disclosed in it, always press forward into possibilities? It is because the understanding has in itself the existential structure which we call projection. With equal primordiality, the understanding projects Dasein's being both upon its for the sake of which, and upon significance, as the worldhood of its current world. The character of understanding as projection is constitutive for being in the world with regard to the disclosedness of its existentially constitutive state of being, by which the factical potentiality for being gets its leeway, Spielraum. And as thrown, Dasein is thrown into the kind of being which we call projecting. Projecting has nothing to do with comporting oneself towards a plan that has been thought out, and in accordance with which Dasein arranges its being. On the contrary, any Dasein has, as Dasein, already projected itself, and as long as it is projecting. As long as it is, Dasein always has understood itself, and always will understand itself in terms of possibilities. Furthermore, the character of understanding as projection is such that the understanding does not grasp thematically that upon which it projects, that is to say, possibilities. Grasping it in such a manner would take away from what is projected its very character as a possibility, and would reduce it to the given contents which we have in mind, whereas projection, in throwing, throws before itself the possibility as possibility, and lets it be as such. As projecting, understanding is the kind of being of Dasein in which it is its possibilities as possibilities. Because of the kind of being which is constituted by the existentiale of projection, Dasein is constantly more than it factually is, supposing that one might want to make an inventory of it as something at hand, and list the content of its being, and supposing that one were able to do so. But Dasein is never more than it factically is, for to its facticity, its potentiality for being belongs essentially. Yet as being possible, moreover, Dasein is never anything less. That is to say, it is existentially that which, in its potentiality for being, it is not yet. Only because the being of the there receives its constitution through understanding and through the character of understanding as projection, only because it is what it becomes, or alternatively does not become, can it say to itself, "Become what you are," and say this with understanding. Projection always pertains to the full discloseness of being in the world. As potentiality for being, understanding has itself possibilities, which are sketched out beforehand within the range of what is essentially disclosable in it. Understanding can devote itself primarily to the discloseness of the world. That is, Dasein can, proximally and for the most part, understand itself in terms of its world. Or else, understanding throws itself primarily into the for the sake of which. That is, Dasein exists as itself. Understanding is either authentic, arising out of one's own self as such, or inauthentic. The in of inauthentic does not mean that Dasein cuts itself off from itself and understands only the world. The world belongs to being oneself as being in the world. On the other hand, authentic understanding, no less than that which is inauthentic, can be either genuine or not genuine. As potentiality for being, understanding is altogether permeated with possibility. When one is diverted into, sich verlegen in, one of these basic possibilities of understanding, the other is not laid aside, legt nicht ab, because understanding in every case pertains rather to Dasein's full discloseness as being in the world. This diversion of the understanding is an existential modification of projection as a whole. In understanding the world, being in is always understood along with it, while understanding of existence as such is always an understanding of the world. As factical Dasein, any Dasein has already diverted its potentiality for being into a possibility of understanding. In its projective character, understanding goes to make up existentially what we call Dasein's sight, Sicht. With the discloseness of the there, this sight is existentially, existential seiende. And Dasein is this sight equiprimordially in each of those basic ways of its being which we have already noted. As the circumspection, Umsicht of concern, as the considerateness, Rücksicht of solicitude, and as that sight which is directed upon being as such, Sicht auf das Sein als solches, for the sake of which any Dasein is as it is. The sight which is related primarily and on the whole to existence we call transparency, Durchsichtigkeit. We choose this term to designate knowledge of the self, in a sense which is well understood, so as to indicate that here it is not a matter of perceptually tracking down and inspecting a point called the self, but rather one of seizing upon the full discloseness of being in the world throughout all the constitutive items which are essential to it, and doing so with understanding. In existing entities, sight themselves, sichtet sich, only insofar as they have become transparent to themselves, with equal primordiality in those items which are constitutive for their existence, their being alongside the world, and their being with others. On the other hand, Dasein's opaqueness, Undurchsichtigkeit, is not rooted primarily and solely in egocentric self-deceptions. It is rooted just as much in lack of acquaintance with the world. We must, to be sure, guard against a misunderstanding of the expression sight. It corresponds to the clearedness, Gelichtetheit, which we took as characterizing the discloseness of the there. Seeing does not mean just perceiving with the bodily eyes, but neither does it mean pure non-sensory awareness of something present at hand in its presence at hand, In giving an existential signification to sight, we have merely drawn upon the peculiar feature of seeing, that it lets entities which are accessible to it be encountered unconcededly in themselves. Of course, every sense does this within that domain of discovery which is genuinely its own. But from the beginning onwards, the tradition of philosophy has been oriented primarily towards seeing as a way of access to entities and to being. To keep the connection with this tradition, we may formalize sight and seeing enough to obtain therewith a universal term for characterizing any access to entities or to being as access in general. By showing how all sight is grounded primarily in understanding, the circumspection of concern is understanding as common sense, Verständigkeit, we have deprived pure intuition, Anschauen, of its priority, which corresponds noetically to the priority of the present at hand in traditional ontology. Intuition and thinking are both derivatives of understanding, and already rather remote ones. Even the phenomenological intuition of essences, Wesensschau, is grounded in existential understanding. We can decide about this kind of seeing only if we have obtained explicit conceptions of being and of the structure of being, such as only phenomena in the phenomenological sense can become. The disclosedness of the there in understanding is itself a way of Dasein's potentiality for being, in the way in which its being is projected both upon the for the sake of which, and upon significance, the world. There lies the disclosedness of being in general. Understanding of being has already been taken for granted in projecting upon possibilities. In projection, being is understood, though not ontologically conceived. An entity whose kind of being is the essential projection of being in the world has understanding of being, and has this as constitutive for its being. What was posited dogmatically at an earlier stage now gets exhibited in terms of the constitution of the being in which Dasein as understanding is its there. The existential meaning of this understanding of being cannot be satisfactorily clarified within the limits of this investigation, except on the basis of the temporal interpretation of being. As existentialia, states of mind and understanding characterize the primordial disclosedness of being in the world. By way of having a mood, Dasein sees possibilities, in terms of which it is. In the projective disclosure of such possibilities, it already has a mood in every case. The projection of its ownmost potentiality for being has been delivered over to the fact of its thrownness into the there. Has not Dasein's being become more enigmatical now that we have explicated the existential constitution of the being of the there, in the sense of thrown projection? It has indeed. We must first let the full enigmatical character of this being emerge, even if all we can do is to come to a genuine breakdown over its solution, and to formulate anew the question about the being of thrown projective being in the world. But in the first instance, even if we are just to bring into view the everyday kind of being in which there is understanding with a state of mind, and if we are to do so in a way which is phenomenally adequate to the full disclosedness of the there, we must work out these existentialia, existential things, concretely. Section 32. Understanding and Interpretation. As understanding, Dasein projects its being upon possibilities. This being towards possibilities which understands is itself a potentiality for being, and it is so because of the way these possibilities, as disclosed, exert their counterthrust, Rückschlag, upon Dasein. The projecting of the understanding has its own possibility, that of developing itself, sich auszubilden. This development of the understanding we call interpretation. In it, the understanding appropriates understandingly that which is understood by it. In interpretation, understanding does not become something different. It becomes itself. Such interpretation is grounded existentially in understanding. The latter does not arise from the former, nor is interpretation the acquiring of information about what is understood. It is rather the working out of possibilities projected in understanding. In accordance with the trend of these preparatory analyses of everyday Dasein, we shall pursue the phenomenon of interpretation in understanding the world, that is, in inauthentic understanding, and indeed in the mode of its genuineness. In terms of the significance which is disclosed in understanding the world, concernful being alongside, the ready to hand, gives itself to understand whatever involvement that which is encountered can have. To say that circumspection discovers means that the world which has already been understood comes to be interpreted. The ready to hand comes explicitly into the sight which understands. All preparing, putting to rights, repairing, improving, rounding out, are accomplished in the following way. We take part in its in order to that which is circumspectively ready to hand, and we concern ourselves with it in accordance with what becomes visible through this process. That which has been circumspectively taken apart with regard to its in order to, and taken apart as such, that which is explicitly understood, has the structure of something as something. The circumspective question as to what this particular thing that is ready to hand may be receives the circumspectively interpretative answer that it is for such and such a purpose. Es ist zum. If we tell what it is for, das wozu, we're not simply designating something, but that which is designated is understood as that as which we are to take the thing in question. That which is disclosed in understanding that which is understood is already accessible in such a way that its as which can be made to stand out explicitly. The as makes up the structure of the explicitness of something that is understood. It constitutes the interpretation. In dealing with what is environmentally ready to hand by interpreting it circumspectively, we see it as a table, a door, a carriage or a bridge. But what we have thus interpreted, ausgelegte, need not necessarily be also taken apart, auseinanderzulegen, by making an assertion which definitely characterizes it. Any mere pre-predicative seeing of the ready to hand is in itself something which already understands and interprets. But does not the absence of such an as make up the mereness of any pure perception of something? Whenever we see with this kind of sight, we already do so understandingly and interpretatively. In the mere encountering of something, it is understood in terms of a totality of involvements. And such seeing hides in itself the explicitness of the assignment relations, of the in order to, which belong to that totality. That which is understood gets articulated when the entity to be understood is brought close interpretatively by taking as our clue the something as something. And this articulation lies before, liegt vor, our making any thematic assertion about it. In such an assertion, the as does not turn up for the first time. It just gets expressed for the first time, and this is possible only in that it lies before us as something expressible. The fact that when we look at something, the explicitness of assertion can be absent, does not justify our denying that there is any articulative interpretation in such mere seeing, and hence that there is any as structure in it. When we have to do with anything, the mere seeing of the things which are closest to us bears in itself the structure of interpretation, and in so primordial a manner that just to grasp something free, as it were, of the as, requires a certain readjustment. When we merely stare at something, our just having it before us lies before us as a failure to understand it any more. This grasping, which is free of the as, is a privation of the kind of seeing in which one merely understands. It is not more primordial than that kind of seeing, but is derived from it. If the as is ontically unexpressed, this must not seduce us into overlooking it as a constitutive state for understanding, existential and a priori. But if we never perceive equipment that is ready to hand without already understanding and interpreting it, and if such perception lets us circumspectively encounter something as something else, does this not mean that, in the first instance, we have experienced something purely present at hand, and then taken it as a door, as a house? This would be a misunderstanding of the specific way in which interpretation functions as disclosure. In interpreting, we do not, so to speak, throw a signification over some naked thing which is present at hand. We do not stick a value on it. But when something within the world is encountered as such, the thing in question already has an involvement which is disclosed in our understanding of the world. And this involvement is one which gets laid out by the interpretation. The ready-to-hand is always understood in terms of a totality of involvements. This totality need not be grasped explicitly by a thematic interpretation. Even if it has undergone such an interpretation, it recedes into an understanding which does not stand out from the background. And this is the very mode in which it is the essential foundation for everyday circumspective interpretation. In every case, this interpretation is grounded in something we have in advance, in a fore-having. As the appropriation of understanding, the interpretation operates in being towards a totality of involvements which is already understood, a being which understands. When something is understood but is still veiled, it becomes unveiled by an act of appropriation, and this is always done under the guidance of a point of view, which fixes that with regard to which what is understood is to be interpreted. In every case, interpretation is grounded in something we see in advance, in a foresight. This foresight takes the first cut out of what has been taken into our fore-having, and it does so with a view to a definite way in which this can be interpreted. Anything understood which is held in our fore-having and towards which we set our sights foresightedly becomes conceptualizable through the interpretation. In such an interpretation, the way in which the entity we are interpreting is to be conceived can be drawn from the entity itself, or the interpretation can force the entity into concepts to which it is opposed in its manner of being. In either case, the interpretation has already decided for a definite way of conceiving it, either with finality or with reservations. It is grounded in something we grasp in advance, in a fore-conception. Whenever something is interpreted as something, the interpretation will be founded essentially upon fore-having, foresight, and fore-conception. An interpretation is never a presuppositionless apprehending of something presented to us. If, when one is engaged in a particular concrete kind of interpretation, in the sense of exact textual interpretation, one likes to appeal, beruft, to what stands there, then one finds that what stands there in the first instance is nothing other than the obvious, undiscussed assumption, Vormeinung of the person who does the interpreting. In an interpretative approach there lies such an assumption as that which has been taken for granted, gesetzt, with the interpretation as such. That is to say, as that which has been presented in our fore-having, our foresight, and our fore-conception. How are we to conceive the character of this fore? Have we done so if we say formally that this is something a priori? Why does understanding, which we have designated as a fundamental existentiale of Dasein, have this structure as its own? Anything interpreted as something interpreted has the as structure as its own. And how is this related to the for structure? The phenomenon of the as structure is manifestly not to be dissolved or broken up into pieces, but is a primordial analytic for it, thus ruled out. Are we to concede that such phenomena are ultimates? Then there would still remain the question, why? Or do the for-structure of understanding and the as-structure of interpretation show an existential, ontological connection with the phenomenon of projection? And does this phenomenon point back to a primordial state of Dasein's being? Before we answer these questions, for which the preparation up till now has been far from sufficient, we must investigate whether what has become visible as the for-structure of understanding and the as-structure of interpretation does not itself already present us with a unitary phenomenon, one of which copious use is made in philosophical problematics, though what is used so universally falls short of the primordiality of ontological explication. In the projecting of the understanding, entities are disclosed in their possibility. The character of the possibility corresponds on each occasion with the kind of being of the entity which is understood. Entities within the world generally are projected upon the world, that is, upon a world of significance, to whose reference relations concern as being in the world has been tied up in advance. When entities within the world are discovered along with the being of Dasein, that is, when they have come to be understood, we say that they have meaning, Sinn. But that which is understood, taken strictly, is not the meaning, but the entity, or alternatively being. Meaning is that wherein the intelligibility, Verständlichkeit of something maintains itself. That which can be articulated in a disclosure, by which we understand, we call meaning. The concept of meaning embraces the formal existential framework of what necessarily belongs to that which an understanding interpretation articulates. Meaning is the upon which of a projection in terms of which something becomes intelligible as something. It gets its structure from a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception. Insofar as understanding and interpretation make up the existential state of being of the there, meaning must be conceived as the formal existential framework of the disclosedness which belongs to understanding. Meaning is an existentiale of Dasein, not a property attaching to entities lying behind them or floating somewhere as an intermediate domain. Dasein only has meaning so far as the disclosedness of being in the world can be filled in by the entities discoverable in that disclosedness. Hence only Dasein can be meaningful, sinnvoll, or meaningless, sinnlos. That is to say, its own being and the entities disclosed with its being can be appropriated in understanding, or can remain relegated to non-understanding. This interpretation of the concept of meaning is one which is ontologico-existential in principle. If we adhere to it, then all entities whose kind of being is of a character other than Dasein's must be conceived as unmeaning, unsinniges, essentially devoid of any meaning at all. Here, unmeaning does not signify that we are saying anything about the value of such entities, but it gives expression to an ontological characteristic, and only that which is unmeaning can be absurd, widersinnig. The present at hand, as Dasein encounters it, can, as it were, assault Dasein's being. Natural events, for instance, can break in upon us and destroy us. And if we are inquiring about the meaning of being, our investigation does not then become a deep one, tiefsinnig, nor does it puzzle out what stands behind being. It asks about being itself insofar as being enters into the intelligibility of Dasein. The meaning of being can never be contrasted with entities, or with being as the ground, which gives entities support, for a ground becomes accessible only as meaning, even if it is itself the abyss of meaninglessness. As the disclosedness of the there, understanding always pertains to the whole of being in the world. In every understanding of the world, existence is understood with it, and vice versa. All interpretation, moreover, operates in the for-structure which we have already characterized. Any interpretation which is to contribute understanding must already have understood what is to be interpreted. This is a fact that has always been remarked, even if only in the area of derivative ways of understanding and interpretation, such as philological interpretation. The latter belongs within the range of scientific knowledge. Such knowledge demands the rigor of a demonstration to provide grounds for it. In a scientific proof we may not presuppose what it is our task to provide grounds for. But if interpretation must in any case already operate in that which is understood, and if it must draw its nurture from this, how is it to bring any scientific results to maturity without moving in a circle, especially if, moreover, the understanding which is presupposed still operates within our common information about man and the world? Yet according to the most elementary rules of logic, this circle is a circulus vitiosus, vicious circle. If that be so, however, the business of historiological interpretation is excluded a priori from the domain of rigorous knowledge. Insofar as the fact of this circle in understanding is not eliminated, historiology must then be resigned to less rigorous possibilities of knowing. Historiology is permitted to compensate for this defect to some extent through the spiritual signification of its objects. But even in the opinion of the historian himself, it would admittedly be more ideal if the circle could be avoided, and if there remained the hope of creating some time a historiology which would be as independent of the standpoint of the observer as our knowledge of nature is supposed to be. But if we see this circle as a vicious one and look out for ways of avoiding it, even if we just sense it as an inevitable imperfection, then the act of understanding has been misunderstood from the ground up. The assimilation of understanding and interpretation to a definite ideal of knowledge is not the issue here. Such an ideal is itself only a subspecies of understanding, a subspecies which has strayed into the legitimate task of grasping the present at hand in its essential unintelligibility, Unverständlichkeit. If the basic conditions which make interpretation possible are to be fulfilled, this must rather be done by not failing to recognize beforehand the essential conditions under which it can be performed. What is decisive is not to get out of the circle, but to come into it in the right way. This circle of understanding is not an orbit in which any random kind of knowledge may move. It is the expression of the existential four-structure of Dasein itself. It is not to be reduced to the level of a vicious circle, or even of a circle which is merely tolerated. In the circle is hidden a positive possibility of the most primordial kind of knowing. To be sure, we genuinely take hold of this possibility only when, in our interpretation, we have understood that our first, last, and constant task is never to allow our forehaving, foresight, and foreconception to be presented to us by fancies and popular conceptions, but rather to make the scientific theme secure by working out these four structures in terms of the things themselves. Because understanding, in accordance with its existential meaning, is Dasein's own potentiality for being, the ontological presuppositions of historiological knowledge transcend in principle the idea of rigor held in the most exact sciences. Mathematics is not more rigorous than historiology, but only narrower, because the existential foundations relevant for it lie within a narrower range. The circle in understanding belongs to the structure of meaning, and the latter phenomenon is rooted in the existential constitution of Dasein, that is, in the understanding which interprets, an entity for which, as being in the world, its being is itself an issue, has ontologically a circular structure. If, however, we note that circularity belongs ontologically to a kind of being which is present at hand, namely to subsistence, Bestand, we must altogether avoid using this phenomenon to characterize anything like Dasein ontologically. Logically. Section 33. Assertion as a derivative mode of interpretation. All interpretation is grounded on understanding. That which has been articulated as such an interpretation and sketched out beforehand in the understanding in general as something articulable is the meaning. Insofar as assertion, judgment, is grounded on understanding and presents us with a derivative form in which an interpretation has been carried out, it too has a meaning. Yet this meaning cannot be defined as something which occurs in, a judgment along with the judging itself. In our present context, we shall give an explicit analysis of assertion, and this analysis will serve several purposes. For one thing, it can be demonstrated by considering assertion in what ways the structure of the as, which is constitutive for understanding and interpretation, can be modified. When this has been done, both understanding and interpretation will be brought more sharply into view. For another thing, the analysis of assertion has a special position in the problematic of fundamental ontology because, in the decisive period when ancient ontology was beginning, the logos functioned as the only clue for obtaining access to that which authentically is, zum Eigentlichseinden, and for defining the being of such entities. Finally, assertion has been accepted from ancient times as the primary and authentic locus of truth. The phenomenon of truth is so thoroughly coupled with the problem of being that our investigation, as it proceeds further, will necessarily come up against the problem of truth, and it already lies within the dimensions of that problem, though not explicitly. The analysis of assertion will at the same time prepare the way for this latter problematic. In what follows we give three significations to the term assertion. These are drawn from the phenomenon which is thus designated, they are connected among themselves, and in their unity they encompass the full structure of assertion. 1. The primary signification of assertion is pointing out, aufzeigen. In this we adhere to the primordial meaning, logos as apophansis, discourse as making clear, letting an entity be seen from itself. In the assertion the hammer is too heavy, what is discovered for sight is not a meaning, but an entity in the way that it is ready to hand. Even if this entity is not close enough to be grasped and seen, the pointing out has in view the entity itself and not, let us say, a mere representation, Vorstellung of it, neither something merely represented, nor the psychical condition in which the person who makes the assertion represents it. 2. Assertion means no less than predication. We assert a predicate of a subject, and the subject is given a definite character, bestimmt, by the predicate. In this signification of assertion, that which is put forward in the assertion, das Ausgesagte, is not the predicate, but the hammer itself. On the other hand, that which does the asserting, das Aussagende, in other words, that which gives something a definite character, lies in the too heavy. That which is put forward in the assertion in the second signification of assertion, that which is given a definite character as such, has undergone a narrowing of content as compared with what is put forward in the assertion in the first signification of this term. Every predication is what it is only as a pointing out. The second signification of assertion has its foundation in the first. Within this pointing out, the elements which are articulated in predication, the subject and predicate, arise. It is not by giving something a definite character that we first discover that which shows itself, the hammer, as such. But when we give it such a character, our seeing gets restricted to it in the first instance, so that by this explicit restriction of our view, that which is already manifest may be made explicitly manifest in its definite character. In giving something a definite character, we must, in the first instance, take a step back. When confronted with that which is already manifest, the hammer that is too heavy. In setting down the subject, we dim entities down to focus in that hammer there, so that by thus dimming them down we may let that which is manifest be seen in its own definite character, as a character that can be determined. Setting down the subject, setting down the predicate, and setting down the two together are thoroughly apophantical, in the strict sense of the word. 3. Assertion means communication, Mitteilung. Speaking forth, Heraussage. As communication, it is directly related to assertion in the first and second significations. It is letting someone see with us what we have pointed out by way of giving it a definite character. Letting someone see with us shares with, teilt mit, the other, that entity which has been pointed out in its definite character. That which is shared is our being towards what has been pointed out, a being in which we see it in common. One must keep in mind that this being towards is being in the world, and that from out of this very world, what has been pointed out gets encountered. Any assertion, as a communication understood in this existential manner, must have been expressed. As something communicated, that which has been put forward in the assertion is something that others can share, with the person making the assertion, even though the entity which he has pointed out and to which he has given a definite character is not close enough for them to grasp and see it. That which is put forward in the assertion is something which can be passed along in further retelling. There is a widening of the range of that mutual sharing which sees. But at the same time, what has been pointed out may become veiled again in this further retelling, although even the kind of knowing which arises in such hearsay, whether knowledge that something is the case, wissen, or merely an acquaintance with something, kennen, always has the entity itself in view and does not give assent to some valid meaning which has been passed around. Even hearsay is a being in the world and a being towards what is heard. There is prevalent today a theory of judgment which is oriented to the phenomenon of validity. We shall not give an extensive discussion of it here. It will be sufficient to allude to the very questionable character of this phenomenon of validity, though since the time of Lotze people have been fond of passing this off as a primal phenomenon which cannot be traced back any further. The fact that it can play this role is due only to its ontologically unclarified character. The problematic which has established itself round this idolized word is no less opaque. In the first place, validity is viewed as the form of actuality which goes with the content of the judgment, insofar as that content remains unchanged as opposed to the changeable psychical process of judgment. Considering how the status of the question of being in general has been characterized in the introduction to this treatise, we would scarcely venture to expect that validity as ideal being is distinguished by special ontological clarity. In the second place, validity means at the same time the validity of the meaning of the judgment, which is valid of the object it has in view, and thus it attains the signification of an objectively valid character, and of objectivity in general. In the third place, the meaning which is thus valid of an entity, and which is valid timelessly in itself, is said to be valid also in the sense of being valid for everyone who judges rationally. Validity now means a bindingness, or universally valid character. Even if one were to advocate a critical epistemological theory, according to which the subject does not really come out to the object, then this valid character, as the validity of an object, objectivity, is grounded upon that stock of true, meaning which is itself valid. The three significations of being valid which we have set forth, the way of being of the ideal, objectivity, and bindingness, not only are opaque in themselves, but constantly get confused with one another. Methodological foresight demands that we do not choose such unstable concepts as a clue to interpretation. We make no advance restriction upon the concept of meaning which would confine it to signifying the content of judgment, but we understand it as the existential phenomenon already characterized, in which the formal framework of what can be disclosed in understanding and articulated in interpretation becomes visible. If we bring together the three significations of assertion, which we have analyzed, and get a unitary view of the full phenomenon, then we may define assertion as a pointing out which gives something a definite character and which communicates. It remains to ask with what justification we have taken assertion as a mode of interpretation at all. If it is something of this sort, then the essential structures of interpretation must recur in it. The pointing out, which assertion does, is performed on the basis of what has already been disclosed in understanding, or discovered circumspectively. Assertion is not a free-floating kind of behavior, which, in its own right, might be capable of disclosing entities in general in a primary way. On the contrary, it always maintains itself on the basis of being in the world. What we have shown earlier in relation to knowing the world holds just as well as assertion. Any assertion requires a forehaving of whatever has been disclosed, and this is what it points out by way of giving something a definite character. Furthermore, in any approach, when one gives something a definite character, one is already taking a look directionally at what is to be put forward in the assertion. When an entity which has been presented is given a definite character, the function of giving it such a character is taken over by that with regard to which we set our sights towards the entity. Thus any assertion requires a foresight, in this the predicate which we are to assign, zuzuweisende, and make stand out, gets loosened, so to speak, from its unexpressed inclusion in the entity itself. To any assertion as a communication which gives something a definite character there belongs, moreover, an articulation of what is pointed out, and this articulation is in accordance with significations. Such an assertion will operate with a definite way of conceiving. The hammer is heavy. Heaviness belongs to the hammer. The hammer has the property of heaviness. When an assertion is made, some foreconception is always implied, but it remains for the most part inconspicuous, because the language already hides in itself a developed way of conceiving. Like any interpretation whatever, assertion necessarily has a forehaving, a foresight, and a foreconception as its existential foundations. But to what extent does it become a derivative mode of interpretation? What has been modified in it? We can point out the modification if we stick to certain limiting cases of assertion which function in logic as normal cases and as examples of the simplest assertion phenomena. Prior to all analysis, logic has already understood logically what it takes as a theme under the heading of the categorical statement, for instance. The hammer is heavy. The unexplained presupposition is that the meaning of this sentence is to be taken as, this thing, a hammer, has the property of heaviness. In concernful circumspection there are no such assertions at first. But such circumspection has of course its specific ways of interpreting, and these, as compared with the theoretical judgment just mentioned, may take some such form as the hammer is too heavy, or rather just too heavy. Hand me the other hammer. Interpretation is carried out primordially not in a theoretical statement, but in an action of circumspective concern, laying aside the unsuitable tool or exchanging it without wasting words. From the fact that words are absent, it may not be concluded that interpretation is absent. On the other hand, the kind of interpretation which is circumspectively expressed is not necessarily already an assertion in the sense we have defined. By what existential ontological modifications does assertion arise from circumspective interpretation? The entity which is held in our forehaving, for instance the hammer, is proximally ready to hand as equipment. If this entity becomes the object of an assertion, then as soon as we begin this assertion, there is already a changeover in the forehaving. Something ready to hand with which we have to do or perform something turns into something about which the assertion that points it out is made. Our foresight is aimed at something present at hand in what is ready to hand. Both by and for this way of looking at it, Hinsicht, the ready-to-hand becomes veiled as ready-to-hand. Within this discovering of presence at hand, which is at the same time a covering up of readiness to hand, something present at hand which we encounter is given a definite character in its being present at hand in such and such a manner. Only now are we given any access to properties or the like. When an assertion has given a definite character to something present at hand, it says something about it as a what, and this what is drawn from that which is present at hand as such. The as structure of interpretation has undergone a modification. In its function of appropriating what is understood, the as no longer reaches out into a totality of involvements. As regards its possibilities for articulating reference relations, it has been cut off from that significance which, as such, constitutes environmentality. The as gets pushed back into the uniform plane of that which is merely present at hand. It dwindles to the structure of just letting one see what is present at hand, and letting one see it in a definite way. This levelling of the primordial as of circumspective interpretation to the as with which presence at hand is given a definite character is the specialty of assertion. Only so does it obtain the possibility of exhibiting something in such a way that we just look at it. Thus, assertion cannot disown its ontological origin from an interpretation which understands. The primordial as of an interpretation, hermeneia, which understands circumspectively, we call the existential hermeneutical as, in distinction from the apophantical as of the assertion. Between the kind of interpretation which is still wholly wrapped up in concernful understanding and the extreme opposite case of a theoretical assertion about something present at hand, there are many intermediate gradations: assertions about the happenings in the environment, accounts of the ready-to-hand, reports on the situation, the recording and fixing of the facts of the case, the description of a state of affairs, the narration of something that has befallen. We cannot trace back these sentences to theoretical statements without essentially perverting their meaning. Like the theoretical statements themselves, they have their source in circumspective interpretation. With the progress of knowledge about the structure of the logos, it was inevitable that this phenomenon of the apophantical as should come into view in some form or other. The manner in which it was proximally seen was not accidental, and did not fail to work itself out in the subsequent history of logic. When considered philosophically, the logos itself is an entity, and according to the orientation of ancient ontology, it is something present at hand. Words are proximally present at hand. That is to say, we come across them just as we come across things. And this holds for any sequence of words, as that in which the logos expresses itself. In this first search for the structure of the logos, as thus present at hand, what was found was the being present at hand together of several words. What establishes the unity of this together? As Plato knew, this unity lies in the fact that the logos is always logos tinos, discourse of something. In the logos, an entity is manifest, and with a view to this entity, the words are put together in one verbal whole. Aristotle saw this more radically. Every logos is both synthesis and diairesis, affirmative judgment and negative judgment. Not just the one, call it affirmative judgment, or the other, call it negative judgment. Rather, every assertion, whether it affirms or denies, whether it is true or false, is synthesis and diairesis, affirmative and negative judgment, equiprimordially. To exhibit anything is to take it together and to take it apart. It is true, of course, that Aristotle did not pursue the analytical question as far as the problem of which phenomenon within the structure of the logos is the one that permits and indeed obliges us to characterize every statement as synthesis and diairesis. Along with the formal structures of binding and separating, or more precisely along with the unity of these, we should meet the phenomenon of the something as something, and we should meet this as a phenomenon. In accordance with this structure, something is understood with regard to something. It is taken together with it, yet in such a way that this confrontation which understands will at the same time take apart what has been taken together, and will do so by articulating it interpretatively. If the phenomenon of the as remains covered up, and above all if its existential source in the hermeneutical as is veiled, then Aristotle's phenomenological approach to the analysis of the logos collapses to a superficial theory of judgment, in which judgment becomes the binding or separating of representations and concepts. Binding and separating may be formalized still further to a relating. The judgment gets dissolved logistically into a system in which things are coordinated with one another. It becomes the object of a calculus, but it does not become a theme for ontological interpretation. The possibility and impossibility of getting an analytical understanding of synthesis and diairesis, affirmative and negative judgment, of the relation in judgment generally, is tightly linked up with whatever the current status of the ontological problematic and its principles may be. How far this problematic has worked its way into the interpretation of the logos, and how far, on the other hand, the concept of judgment has, by a remarkable counterthrust, worked its way into the ontological problematic, is shown by the phenomenon of the copula, link. When we consider this bond, it becomes clear that proximally the synthesis structure is regarded as self-evident, and that it has also retained the function of serving as a standard for interpretation. But if the formal characteristics of relating and binding can contribute nothing phenomenally towards the structural analysis of the logos as subject matter, then in the long run the phenomenon to which we allude by the term copula has nothing to do with a bond or binding. The interpretation of the is, whether it be expressed in its own right in the language or indicated in the verbal ending, leads us therefore into the context of problems belonging to the existential analytic, if assertion and the understanding of being are existential possibilities for the being of Dasein itself. When we come to work out the question of being, we shall thus encounter again this peculiar phenomenon of being which we meet within the logos. By demonstrating that assertion is derived from interpretation and understanding, we have made it plain that the logic of the logos is rooted in the existential analytic of Dasein, and provisionally this has been sufficient. At the same time, by knowing that the logos has been interpreted in a way which is ontologically inadequate, we have gained a sharper insight into the fact that the methodological basis on which ancient ontology arose was not a primordial one. The logos gets experienced as something present at hand and interpreted as such, while at the same time the entities which it points out have the meaning of presence at hand. This meaning of being is left undifferentiated and uncontrasted with other possibilities of being, so that being in the sense of a formal being something becomes fused with it simultaneously, and we are unable even to obtain a clear-cut division between these two realms. Realms. Section 34. Being there and Discourse. Language. The fundamental existentialia which constitute the being of the there, the disclosedness of being in the world, are states of mind and understanding. In understanding there lurks the possibility of interpretation, that is, of appropriating what is understood. Insofar as a state of mind is equiprimordial with an act of understanding, it maintains itself in a certain understanding. Thus there corresponds to it a certain capacity for getting interpreted. We have seen that assertion is derived from interpretation, and is an extreme case of it. In clarifying the third signification of assertion as communication, speaking forth, we were led to the concepts of saying and speaking, to which we had purposely given no attention up to that point. The fact that language now becomes our theme for the first time will indicate that this phenomenon has its roots in the existential constitution of Dasein's disclosedness. The existential ontological foundation of language is discourse, or talk. This phenomenon is one of which we have been making constant use already in our foregoing interpretation of state of mind, understanding, interpretation, and assertion, but we have, as it were, kept it suppressed in our thematic analysis. Discourse is existentially equiprimordial with state of mind and understanding. The intelligibility of something has always been articulated even before there is any appropriative interpretation of it. Discourse is the articulation of intelligibility. Therefore it underlies both interpretation and assertion. That which can be articulated in interpretation, and thus even more primordially in discourse, is what we have called meaning. That which gets articulated as such in discursive articulation we call the totality of significations, Bedeutungsganze. This can be dissolved or broken up into significations. Significations, as what has been articulated from that which can be articulated, always carry meaning, sind sinnhaft. If discourse, as the articulation of the intelligibility of the there, is a primordial existentiale of disclosedness, and if disclosedness is primarily constituted by being in the world, then discourse too must have essentially a kind of being which is specifically worldly. The intelligibility of being in the world, an intelligibility which goes with a state of mind, expresses itself as discourse. The totality of significations of intelligibility is put into words, To significations words accrue, but word things do not get supplied with significations. The way in which discourse gets expressed is language. Language is a totality of words, a totality in which discourse has a worldly being of its own. And as an entity within the world, this totality thus becomes something which we may come across as ready to hand. Language can be broken up into word things which are present at hand. Discourse is existentially language, because that entity whose disclosedness it articulates, according to significations, has, as its kind of being in the world, a being which has been thrown and submitted to the world. As an existential state in which Dasein is disclosed, discourse is constitutive for Dasein's existence. Hearing and keeping silent, Schweigen, are possibilities belonging to discursive speech. In these phenomena, the constitutive function of discourse for the existentiality of existence becomes entirely plain for the first time. But in the first instance, the issue is one of working out the structure of discourse as such. Discoursing, or talking, is the way in which we articulate significantly the intelligibility of being in the world. Being with belongs to being in the world, which in every case maintains itself in some definite way of concernful being with one another. Such being with one another is discursive, as assenting or refusing, as demanding or warning, as pronouncing, consulting or interceding, as making assertions, and as talking in the way of giving a talk. Talking is talk about something. That which the discourse is about, das worüber der Rede, does not necessarily, or even for the most part, serve as the theme for an assertion in which one gives something a definite character. Even a command is given about something. A wish is about something, and so is intercession. What the discourse is about is a structural item that it necessarily possesses. For discourse helps to constitute the disclosedness of being in the world, and in its own structure it is modelled upon this basic state of Dasein. What is talked about, das Beredete in talk, is always talked to, angeredet, in a definite regard, and within certain limits. In any talk or discourse there is something said in the talk as such, ein Geredetes als solches, something said as such, das Gesagte als solches, whenever one wishes, asks, or expresses oneself about something. In this something said, discourse communicates. As we have already indicated in our analysis of assertion, the phenomenon of communication must be understood in a sense which is ontologically broad. Communication in which one makes assertions, giving information for instance, is a special case of that communication which is grasped in principle existentially. In this more general kind of communication, the articulation of being with one another understandingly is constituted. Through it, a co-state of mind, Mitbefindlichkeit, gets shared, and so does the understanding of being with. Communication is never anything like a conveying of experiences, such as opinions or wishes, from the interior of one subject into the interior of another. Dasein with is already essentially manifest in a co-state of mind and a co-understanding. In discourse, being with becomes explicitly shared, that is to say, it is already. But it is unshared as something that has not been taken hold of and appropriated. Whenever something is communicated in what is said in the talk, all talk about anything has at the same time the character of expressing itself, sich aussprechens. In talking, Dasein expresses itself, spricht sich aus, not because it has in the first instance been encapsulated as something internal, over against something outside, but because as being in the world it is already outside when it understands. What is expressed is precisely this being outside, that is to say, the way in which one currently has a state of mind, mood, which we have shown to pertain to the full disclosedness of being in. Being in and its state of mind are made known in discourse and indicated in language by intonation, modulation, the tempo of talk, the way of speaking. In poetical discourse, the communication of the existential possibilities of one's state of mind, can become a name in itself, and this amounts to a disclosing of existence. In Discourse, the intelligibility of being in the world, an intelligibility which goes with a state of mind, is articulated according to significations, and Discourse is this articulation. The items constitutive for Discourse are what the discourse is about, what is talked about, what is said in the talk as such, the communication, and the making known. These are not properties which can just be raked up empirically from language. They are existential characteristics rooted in the state of Dasein's being, and it is they that first make anything like language ontologically possible. In the factical linguistic form of any definite case of discourse, some of these items may be lacking or may remain unnoticed. The fact that they often do not receive verbal expression is merely an index of some definite kind of discourse which, insofar as it is discourse, must in every case lie within the totality of the structures we have mentioned. Attempts to grasp the essence of language have always taken their orientation from one or another of these items, and the clues to their conceptions of language have been the ideas of expression, of symbolic form, of communication as assertion, of the making known of experiences, of the patterning of life. Even if one were to put these various fragmentary definitions together in syncretistic fashion, nothing would be achieved in the way of a fully adequate definition of language. We would still have to do what is decisive here, to work out in advance the ontologico-existential whole of the structure of discourse on the basis of the analytic of Dasein. We can make clear the connection of discourse with understanding and intelligibility by considering an existential possibility which belongs to talking itself, hearing. If we have not heard aright, it is not by accident that we say that we have not understood. Hearing is constitutive for discourse, and just as linguistic utterance is based on discourse, so is acoustic perception on hearing. Listening to is Dasein's existential way of being open as being with, for others. Indeed, hearing constitutes the primary and authentic way in which Dasein is open for its ownmost potentiality for being, as in hearing the voice of the friend whom every Dasein carries with it. Dasein hears because it understands, and, as a being in the world with others, a being which understands, Dasein is in thrall to Dasein with and to itself, and in its thraldom it belongs to these. Being with develops in listening to one another, aufeinanderhören, which can be done in several possible ways: following, going along with, and the privative modes of not hearing, resisting, defying, and turning away. It is on the basis of this potentiality for hearing, which is existentially primary, that anything like hearkening, horchen, becomes possible. Hearkening is phenomenally still more primordial than what is defined in the first instance as hearing in psychology, the sensing of tones and the perception of sounds. Hearkening too has the kind of being of the hearing which understands. What we first hear is never noises or complexes of sounds, but the creaking wagon, the motorcycle. We hear the column on the march, the north wind, the woodpecker tapping, the fire crackling. It requires a very artificial and complicated frame of mind to hear a pure noise. The fact that motorcycles and wagons are what we proximally hear is the phenomenal evidence that in every case Dasein, as being in the world, already dwells alongside what is ready to hand within the world. It certainly does not dwell proximally alongside sensations, nor would it first have to give shape to the swirl of sensations to provide the springboard from which the subject leaps off and finally arrives at a world. Dasein, as essentially understanding, is proximally alongside what is understood. Likewise, when we are explicitly hearing the discourse of another, we proximally understand what is said, or, to put it more exactly, we are already with him, in advance, alongside the entity which the discourse is about. On the other hand, what we proximally hear is not what is expressed in the utterance. even in cases where the speech is indistinct or in a foreign language, what we proximally hear is unintelligible words, and not a multiplicity of tone data. Admittedly, when what the discourse is about is heard naturally, we can at the same time hear the diction, the way in which it is said, die Weise des Gesagtseins, but only if there is some co-understanding beforehand of what is said in the talk. For only so is there a possibility of estimating whether the way in which it is said is appropriate to what the discourse is about thematically. In the same way, any answering counter-discourse arises proximally and directly from understanding what the discourse is about, which is already shared in being with. Only where talking and hearing are existentially possible can anyone hearken. The person who cannot hear and must feel may perhaps be one who is able to hearken very well, and precisely because of this. Just hearing something all around, das nur herumhören, is a privation of the hearing which understands. Both talking and hearing are based upon understanding, and understanding arises neither through talking at length, vieles reden, nor through busily hearing something all around. Only he who already understands can listen, zuhören. Keeping silent is another essential possibility of discourse, and it has the same existential foundation. In talking with one another, the person who keeps silent can make one understand, that is, he can develop an understanding, and he can do so more authentically than the person who is never short of words. Speaking at length, viel sprechen, about something does not offer the slightest guarantee that thereby understanding is advanced. On the contrary, talking extensively about something covers it up and brings what is understood to a sham clarity, the unintelligibility of the trivial. But to keep silent does not mean to be dumb. On the contrary, if a man is dumb, he still has a tendency to speak. Such a person has not proved that he can keep silence. Indeed, he entirely lacks the possibility of proving anything of the sort. And the person who is accustomed by nature to speak little is no better able to show that he is keeping silent, or that he is the sort of person who can do so. He who never says anything cannot keep silent at any given moment. Keeping silent authentically is possible only in genuine discoursing. To be able to keep silent, Dasein must have something to say, that is, it must have at its disposal an authentic and rich discloseness of itself. In that case, one's reticence, Verschwiegenheit, makes something manifest, and does away with idle talk, Gerede. As a mode of discoursing, reticence articulates the intelligibility of Dasein in so primordial a manner that it gives rise to a potentiality for hearing which is genuine, and to a being with one another which is transparent. Because discourse is constitutive for the being of the there, that is, for states of mind and understanding, while Dasein means being in the world, Dasein as discursive being in has already expressed itself. Dasein has language. Among the Greeks, their everyday existing was largely diverted into talking with one another, but at the same time they had eyes to see. Is it an accident that in both their pre-philosophical and their philosophical ways of interpreting Dasein, they defined the essence of man as zoon logon echon, living thing which has discourse? The later way of interpreting this definition of man in the sense of the animal rationale, something living which has reason, is not indeed false, but it covers up the phenomenal basis for this definition of Dasein. Man shows himself as the entity which talks. This does not signify that the possibility of vocal utterance is peculiar to him, but rather that he is the entity which is such as to discover the world and Dasein itself. The Greeks had no word for language. They understood this phenomenon in the first instance as discourse. But because the logos came into their philosophical ken primarily as assertion, this was the kind of logos which they took as their clue for working out the basic structures of the forms of discourse and its components. Grammar sought its foundations in the logic of this logos. But this logic was based upon the ontology of the present at hand, the basic stock of categories of signification which passed over into the subsequent science of language, and which in principle is still accepted as the standard today, is oriented towards discourse as assertion. But if, on the contrary, we take this phenomenon to have in principle the primordiality and breadth of an existentiale, then there emerges the necessity of re-establishing the science of language on foundations which are ontologically more primordial. The task of liberating grammar from logic requires beforehand a positive understanding of the basic a priori structure of discourse in general as an existentiale. It is not a task that can be carried through later on by improving and rounding out what has been handed down. Bearing this in mind, we must inquire into the basic forms in which it is possible to articulate anything understandable, and to do so in accordance with significations. And this articulation must not be confined to entities within the world, which we cognize by considering them theoretically, and which we express in sentences. A doctrine of signification will not emerge automatically, even if we make a comprehensive comparison of as many languages as possible, and those which are most exotic. To accept, let us say, the philosophical horizon within which W. von Humboldt made language a problem would be no less inadequate. The doctrine of signification is rooted in the ontology of Dasein. Whether it prospers or decays depends on the fate of this ontology. In the last resort, philosophical research must resolve to ask what kind of being goes with language in general. Is it a kind of equipment, ready to hand within the world, or has it Dasein's kind of being, or is it neither of these? What kind of being does language have? If there can be such a thing as a dead language. What do the rise and decline of a language mean ontologically? We possess a science of language, and the being of the entities which it has for its theme is obscure. Even the horizon for any investigative question about it is veiled. Is it an accident that proximally, and for the most part, significations are worldly, sketched out beforehand by the significance of the world, that they are indeed often predominantly spatial? Or does this fact have existential ontological necessity? And if it is necessary, why should it be so? Philosophical research will have to dispense with the philosophy of language if it is to inquire into the things themselves and attain the status of a problematic which has been cleared up conceptually. Our interpretation of language has been designed merely to point out the ontological locus of this phenomenon in Dasein's state of being, and especially to prepare the way for the following analysis in which, taking as our clue a fundamental kind of being belonging to discourse in connection with other phenomena, we shall try to bring Dasein's everydayness into view in a manner which is ontologically more primordial. B. The everyday being of the there and the falling of Dasein. In going back to the existential structures of the discloseness of being in the world, our interpretation has in a way lost sight of Dasein's everydayness. In our analysis we must now regain this phenomenal horizon which was our thematical starting point. The question now arises, what are the existential characteristics of the discloseness of being in the world, so far as the latter, as something which is everyday, maintains itself in the kind of being of the they? Does the they have a state of mind which is specific to it, a special way of understanding, talking, and interpreting? It becomes all the more urgent to answer these questions when we remember that proximally and for the most part, Dasein is absorbed in the they and is mastered by it. Is not Dasein, as thrown being in the world, thrown proximally right into the publicness of the they? And what does this publicness mean other than the specific disclosedness of the they? If understanding must be conceived primarily as Dasein's potentiality for being, then it is from an analysis of the way of understanding and interpreting which belongs to the they that we must gather which possibilities of its being have been disclosed and appropriated by Dasein as they. In that case, however, these possibilities themselves make manifest an essential tendency of being, one which belongs to everydayness. And finally, when this tendency has been explicated in an ontologically adequate manner, it must unveil a primordial kind of being of Dasein. In such a way, indeed, that from this kind of being the phenomenon of thrownness, to which we have called attention, can be exhibited in its existential concreteness. In the first instance, what is required is that the disclosedness of the they, that is, the everyday kind of being of discourse, sight, and interpretation, should be made visible in certain definite phenomena. In relation to these phenomena, it may not be superfluous to remark that our own interpretation is purely ontological in its aims, and is far removed from any moralizing critique of everyday Dasein, and from the aspirations of a philosophy of culture. Section 35. Idle talk. The expression idle talk, Gerede, is not to be used here in a disparaging signification. Terminologically, it signifies a positive phenomenon which constitutes the kind of being of everyday Dasein's understanding and interpreting. For the most part, discourse is expressed by being spoken out, and has always been so expressed. It is language. But in that case, understanding and interpretation already lie in what has thus been expressed. In language, as a way things have been expressed or spoken out, Ausgesprochenheit, there is hidden a way in which the understanding of Dasein has been interpreted. This way of interpreting it is no more just present at hand than language is. On the contrary, its being is itself of the character of Dasein. Proximally, and with certain limits, Dasein is constantly delivered over to this interpretedness, which controls and distributes the possibilities of average understanding and of the state of mind belonging to it. The way things have been expressed or spoken out is such that in the totality of contexts of signification into which it has been articulated, it preserves an understanding of the disclosed world, and therewith equiprimordially an understanding of the Dasein with, of others, and of one's own being in. The understanding, which has thus already been deposited in the way things have been expressed, pertains just as much to any traditional discoveredness of entities which may have been reached, as it does to one's current understanding of being and to whatever possibilities and horizons for fresh interpretation and conceptual articulation may be available. But now we must go beyond a bare allusion to the fact of this interpretedness of Dasein, and must inquire about the existential kind of being of that discourse, which is expressed and which expresses itself. If this cannot be conceived as something present at hand, what is its being? And what does this tell us in principle about Dasein's everyday kind of being? Discourse which expresses itself is communication. Its tendency of being is aimed at bringing the hearer to participate in disclosed being towards what is talked about in the discourse. In the language which is spoken when one expresses oneself there lies an average intelligibility. And in accordance with this intelligibility, the discourse which is communicated can be understood to a considerable extent, even if the hearer does not bring himself into such a kind of being towards what the discourse is about, as to have a primordial understanding of it. We do not so much understand the entities which are talked about. We already are listening only to what is said in the talk, as such. What is said in the talk gets understood, but what the talk is about is understood only approximately and superficially. We have the same thing in view because it is in the same averageness that we have a common understanding of what is said. Hearing and understanding have attached themselves beforehand to what is said in the talk, as such. The primary relationship of being towards the entity talked about is not imparted by communication, but being with one another takes place in talking with one another, and in concern with what is said in the talk. To this being with one another, the fact that talking is going on is a matter of consequence. The being said, the dictum, the pronouncement, Ausspruch, all these now stand surety for the genuineness of the discourse, and of the understanding which belongs to it, and for its appropriateness to the facts. And because this discoursing has lost its primary relationship of being towards the entity talked about, or else has never achieved such a relationship, It does not communicate in such a way as to let this entity be appropriated in a primordial manner, but communicates rather by following the route of gossiping and passing the word along. What is said in the talk, as such, spreads in wider circles and takes on an authoritative character. Things are so because one says so. Idle talk is constituted by just such gossiping and passing the word along, a process by which its initial lack of grounds to stand on, Bodenständigkeit, becomes aggravated to complete groundlessness, Bodenlosigkeit. And indeed, this idle talk is not confined to vocal gossip, but even spreads to what we write, where it takes the form of scribbling, das Geschreibe. In this latter case, the gossip is not based so much upon hearsay. It feeds upon superficial reading, dem Angelesenen. The average understanding of the reader will never be able to decide what has been drawn from primordial sources with a struggle, and how much is just gossip. The average understanding, moreover, will not want any such distinction, and does not need it because, of course, it understands everything. The groundlessness of idle talk is no obstacle to its becoming public. Instead, it encourages this. Idle talk is the possibility of understanding everything without previously making the thing one's own. If this were done, idle talk would founder, and it already guards against such a danger. Idle talk is something which anyone can rake up. It not only releases one from the task of genuinely understanding, but develops an undifferentiated kind of intelligibility, for which nothing is closed off any longer. Discourse, which belongs to the essential state of Dasein's being and has a share in constituting Dasein's disclosedness, has the possibility of becoming idle talk, and when it does so, it serves not so much to keep being in the world open for us, in an articulated understanding, as rather to close it off and cover up the entities within the world. To do this, one need not aim to deceive. Idle talk does not have the kind of being which belongs to conspicuously passing off something as something else. The fact that something has been said groundlessly and then gets passed along in further retelling amounts to perverting the act of disclosing, erschließen, into an act of closing off, verschließen. For what is said is always understood proximally as saying something, that is, an uncovering something. Thus, by its very nature, idle talk is a closing off, since to go back to the ground of what is talked about is something which it leaves undone. This closing off is aggravated afresh by the fact that an understanding of what is talked about is supposedly reached in idle talk. Because of this, idle talk discourages any new inquiry and any disputation, and in a peculiar way suppresses them and holds them back. This way in which things have been interpreted in idle talk has already established itself in Dasein. There are many things with which we first become acquainted in this way, and there is not a little which never gets beyond such an average understanding. This everyday way, in which things have been interpreted, is one into which Dasein has grown, in the first instance, with never a possibility of extrication. In it, out of it, and against it, all genuine understanding, interpreting, and communicating, all rediscovering and appropriating anew, are performed. In no case is a Dasein untouched and unseduced by this way in which things have been interpreted, set before the open country of a world in itself, so that it just beholds what it encounters. The dominance of the public way in which things have been interpreted has already been decisive even for the possibilities of having a mood. That is, for the basic way in which Dasein lets the world matter to it. The they prescribes one's state of mind and determines what and how one sees. Idle talk, which closes things off in the way we have designated, is the kind of being which belongs to Dasein's understanding when that understanding has been uprooted. But idle talk does not occur as a condition which is present at hand in something present at hand. Idle talk has been uprooted existentially, and this uprooting is constant. Ontologically, this means that when Dasein maintains itself in idle talk, it is, as being in the world, cut off from its primary and primordially genuine relationships of being towards the world, towards Dasein with, and towards its very being in. Such a Dasein keeps floating, unattached, in eine Schwebe, yet in so doing it is always alongside the world, with others, and towards itself. To be uprooted in this manner is a possibility of being only for an entity whose disclosedness is constituted by discourse as characterized by understanding and states of mind. That is to say, for an entity whose disclosedness in such an ontologically constitutive state is its there, its in the world. Far from amounting to a not-being of Dasein, this uprooting is rather Dasein's most everyday and most stubborn reality. Yet the obviousness and self-assurance of the average ways in which things have been interpreted are such that while the particular Dasein drifts along towards an ever-increasing groundlessness as it floats, the uncanniness of this floating remains hidden from it under their protecting shelter. Section 36. Curiosity. In our analysis of understanding and of the disclosedness of the there in general, we have alluded to the lumen naturale, natural light, and designated the disclosedness of being in as Dasein's clearing, in which it first becomes possible to have something like sight. Our conception of sight has been gained by looking at the basic kind of disclosure which is characteristic of Dasein, namely understanding, in the sense of the genuine appropriation of those entities towards which Dasein can comport itself in accordance with its essential possibilities of being. The basic state of sight shows itself in a peculiar tendency of being which belongs to everydayness, the tendency towards seeing. We designate this tendency by the term curiosity, Neugier, which characteristically is not confined to seeing, but expresses the tendency towards a peculiar way of letting the world be encountered by us in perception. Our aim in interpreting this phenomenon is in principle one which is existential ontological. We do not restrict ourselves to an orientation towards cognition. Even at an early date, and in Greek philosophy, this was no accident, cognition was conceived in terms of the desire to see. The treatise, which stands first in the collection of Aristotle's treatises on ontology, begins with the sentence, Pantes anthropai to edenai oregontai pusei. All humans naturally desire knowledge. The care for seeing is essential to man's being. This remark introduces an investigation in which Aristotle seeks to uncover the source of all learned exploration of entities and their being by deriving it from that species of Dasein's being which we have just mentioned. This Greek interpretation of the existential genesis of science is not accidental. It brings to explicit understanding what has already been sketched out beforehand in the principle of Parmenides. Toga auto no en estin te kai enai, for knowing and being are the same thing. Being is that which shows itself in the pure perception which belongs to beholding, and only by such seeing does being get discovered. Primordial and genuine truth lies in pure beholding. This thesis has remained the foundation of Western philosophy ever since. The Hegelian dialectic found in it its motivating conception, and is possible only on the basis of it. The remarkable priority of seeing was noticed particularly by Augustine in connection with his interpretation of concupiscentia, concupiscence, ad oculos enim videre proprie pertinet. Seeing belongs properly to the eyes. But we even use this word seeing for the other senses when we devote them to cognizing. For we do not say, hear how it glows, or smell how it glistens, or taste how it shines, or feel how it flashes. But we say of each, see. We say that all this is seen. We not only say, see how that shines when the eyes alone can perceive it, but we even say, see how that sounds, see how that is scented, see how that tastes, see how hard that is. Therefore the experience of the senses in general is designated as the lust of the eyes. For when the issue is one of knowing something, the other senses, by a certain resemblance, take to themselves the function of seeing, a function in which the eyes have priority. What is to be said about this tendency just to perceive? Which existential state of Dasein will become intelligible in the phenomenon of curiosity? Being in the world is proximally absorbed in the world of concern. This concern is guided by circumspection, which discovers the ready-to-hand and preserves it as thus discovered. Whenever we have something to contribute or perform, circumspection gives us the route for proceeding with it, the means of carrying it out, the right opportunity, the appropriate moment. Concern may come to rest in the sense of one's interrupting the performance and taking a rest, or it can do so by getting it finished. In rest, concern does not disappear. Circumspection, however, becomes free and is no longer bound to the world of work. When we take a rest, care subsides into circumspection which has been set free. In the world of work, circumspective discovering has dissevering as the character of its being. When circumspection has been set free, there is no longer anything ready to hand, which we must concern ourselves with bringing close. But as essentially disseverant, this circumspection provides itself with new possibilities of dissevering. This means that it tends away from what is most closely ready to hand and into a far and alien world. Care becomes concern with the possibilities of seeing the world merely as it looks, while one tarries and takes a rest. Dasein seeks what is far away simply in order to bring it close to itself in the way it looks. Dasein lets itself be carried along, mitnehmen, solely by the looks of the world. In this kind of being it concerns itself with becoming rid of itself as being in the world, and rid of its being alongside that which, in the closest everyday manner, is ready to hand. When curiosity has become free, however, it concerns itself with seeing, not in order to understand what is seen, that is, to come into a being towards it, but just in order to see. It seeks novelty only in order to leap from it anew to another novelty. In this kind of seeing, that which is an issue for care does not lie in grasping something and being knowingly in the truth. It lies rather in its possibilities of abandoning itself to the world. Therefore, curiosity is characterized by a specific way of not tarrying alongside what is closest. Consequently, it does not seek the leisure of tarrying observantly, but rather seeks restlessness and the excitement of continual novelty and changing encounters. In not tarrying, curiosity is concerned with the constant possibility of distraction. Curiosity has nothing to do with observing entities and marveling at them. Thaumatzen, to marvel. To be amazed to the point of not understanding is something in which it has no interest. Rather, it concerns itself with a kind of knowing, but just in order to have known. Both this not tarrying in the environment with which one concerns oneself, and this distraction by new possibilities, are constitutive items for curiosity. And upon these is founded the third essential characteristic of this phenomenon, which we call the character of never dwelling anywhere, Aufenthaltslosigkeit. Curiosity is everywhere and nowhere. This mode of being in the world reveals a new kind of being of everyday Dasein, a kind in which Dasein is constantly uprooting itself. Idle talk controls even the ways in which one may be curious. It says what one must have read and seen. In being everywhere and nowhere, curiosity is delivered over to idle talk. These two everyday modes of being for discourse and sight are not just present at hand side by side in their tendency to uproot, but either of these ways to be drags the other one with it. Curiosity, for which nothing is closed off, and idle talk, for which there is nothing that is not understood, provide themselves, that is, the Dasein, which is in this manner, dem so seienden Dasein, with the guarantee of a life which supposedly is genuinely lively. But with this supposition, a third phenomenon now shows itself, by which the disclosedness of everyday Dasein is characterized. Section 37. Ambiguity. When, in our everyday being with one another, we encounter the sort of thing which is accessible to everyone and about which anyone can say anything, it soon becomes impossible to decide what is disclosed in a genuine understanding and what is not. This ambiguity, Zweideutigkeit, extends not only to the world, but just as much to being with one another as such, and even to Dasein's being towards itself. Everything looks as if it were genuinely understood, genuinely taken hold of, genuinely spoken, though at bottom it is not. Or else it does not look so, and yet, at bottom, it is. Ambiguity not only affects the way we avail ourselves of what is accessible for use and enjoyment, and the way we manage it. Ambiguity has already established itself in the understanding as a potentiality for being, and in the way Dasein projects itself and presents itself with possibilities. Everyone is acquainted with what is up for discussion and what occurs, and everyone discusses it. But everyone also knows already how to talk about what has to happen first, about what is not yet up for discussion but really must be done. Already everyone has surmised and scented out in advance what others have also surmised and scented out. This being on the scent is, of course, based upon hearsay, for if anyone is genuinely on the scent of anything, he does not speak about it. And this is the most entangling way in which ambiguity presents Dasein's possibilities, so that they will already be stifled in their power. Even supposing that what they have surmised and scented out should some day be actually translated into deeds, ambiguity has already taken care that interest in what has been realized will promptly die away. Indeed, this interest persists in a kind of curiosity and idle talk only so long as there is a possibility of a non-committal, just surmising with someone else. Being in on it with someone, das mit dabei sein, when one is on the scent, and so long as one is on it, precludes one's allegiance when what has been surmised gets carried out. For in such a case Dasein is in every case forced back on itself. Idle talk and curiosity lose their power, and are already exacting their penalty. When confronted with the carrying through of what they have surmised together, idle talk readily establishes that they could have done that too, for they have indeed surmised it together. In the end, idle talk is even indignant that what it has surmised and constantly demanded now actually happens. In that case, indeed, the opportunity to keep on surmising has been snatched away. But when Dasein goes in for something in the reticence of carrying it through, or even of genuinely breaking down on it, its time is a different time, and, as seen by the public, an essentially slower time than that of idle talk, which lives at a faster rate. Idle talk will thus long since have gone on to something else which is currently the very newest thing. That which was earlier surmise, and has now been carried through, has come too late, if one looks at that which is newest. Idle talk and curiosity take care in their ambiguity to ensure that what is genuinely and newly created is out of date as soon as it emerges before the public. Such a new creation can become free in its positive possibilities only if the idle talk, which covers it up, has become ineffective, and if the common interest has died away. In the ambiguity of the way things have been publicly interpreted, talking about things ahead of the game and making surmises about them curiously, gets passed off as what is really happening, while taking action and carrying something through gets stamped as something merely subsequent and unimportant. Thus Dasein's understanding in the they is constantly going wrong, versieht sich in its projects, as regards the genuine possibilities of being. Dasein is always unambiguously there, that is to say, in that public disclosedness of being with one another, where the loudest idle talk and the most ingenious curiosity keep things moving, where in an everyday manner everything, and at bottom nothing, is happening. This ambiguity is always tossing to curiosity that which it seeks, and it gives idle talk the semblance of having everything decided in it. But this kind of being of the disclosedness of being in the world dominates also being with one another as such. The other is proximally there in terms of what they have heard about him, what they say in their talk about him, and what they know about him. Into primordial being with one another, idle talk first slips itself in between. Everyone keeps his eye on the other first and next, watching how he will comport himself, and what he will say in reply. Being with one another in the they is by no means an indifferent side-by-sideness, in which everything has been settled, but rather an intent, ambiguous watching of one another, a secret and reciprocal listening in. Under the mask of for one another, an against one another is in play. In this connection, we must notice that ambiguity does not first arise from aiming explicitly at disguise or distortion, and that it is not something which the individual Dasein first conjures up. It is already implied in being with one another, as thrown being with one another in a world. Publicly, however, it is quite hidden, and they will always defend themselves against this interpretation of the kind of being, which belongs to the way things have been interpreted by the they, lest it should prove correct. It would be a misunderstanding if we were to seek to have the explication of these phenomena confirmed by looking to the they for agreement. The phenomena of idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity have been set forth in such a manner as to indicate that they are already interconnected in their being. We must now grasp in an existential ontological manner the kind of being which belongs to this interconnection. The basic kind of being which belongs to everydayness is to be understood within the horizon of those structures of Dasein's being which have been hitherto obtained. Section 38. Falling and thrownness. Idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity characterize the way in which, in an everyday manner, Dasein is its there, the discloseness of being in the world. As definite existential characteristics, these are not present at hand in Dasein, but help to make up its being. In these, and in the way they are interconnected in their being, there is revealed a basic kind of being which belongs to everydayness. We call this the falling of Dasein. This term does not express any negative evaluation, but is used to signify that Dasein is proximally and for the most part alongside the world of its concern. This absorption in, aufgehen bei, has mostly the character of being lost in the publicness of the they. Dasein has, in the first instance, fallen away, abgefallen from itself, as an authentic potentiality for being itself, and has fallen into the world. Fallenness into the world means an absorption in being with one another, insofar as the latter is guided by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. Through the interpretation of falling, what we have called the inauthenticity of Dasein may now be defined more precisely. On no account, however, do the terms inauthentic and non-authentic signify really not, as if in this mode of being Dasein were altogether to lose its being. Inauthenticity does not mean anything like being no longer in the world, but amounts rather to a quite distinctive kind of being in the world, the kind which is completely fascinated by the world and by the Dasein with of others in the they. Not being itself, das nicht es selbst sein, functions as a positive possibility of that entity, which, in its essential concern, is absorbed in a world. This kind of not-being has to be conceived as that kind of being which is closest to Dasein and in which Dasein maintains itself for the most part. So neither must we take the fallenness of Dasein as a fall from a purer and higher primal status. Not only do we lack any experience of this ontically, but ontologically we lack any possibilities or clues for interpreting it. In falling, Dasein itself, as factical being in the world, is something from which it has already fallen away, and it has not fallen into some entity which it comes upon for the first time in the course of its being, or even one which it has not come upon at all. It has fallen into the world, which itself belongs to its being. Falling is a definite existential characteristic of Dasein itself. It makes no assertion about Dasein as something present at hand, or about present-at-hand relations to entities from which Dasein is descended, or with which Dasein has subsequently wound up in some sort of commercium, commerce, hence relationship. We would also misunderstand the ontologico-existential structure of falling if we were to ascribe to it the sense of a bad and deplorable ontical property, of which perhaps more advanced stages of human culture might be able to rid themselves. Neither in our first allusion to being in the world as Dasein's basic state, nor in our characterization of its constitutive structural items, did we go beyond an analysis of the constitution of this kind of being, and take note of its character as a phenomenon. We have indeed described concern and solicitude as the possible basic kinds of being in, but we did not discuss the question of the everyday kind of being of these ways in which one may be. We also showed that being in is something quite different from a mere confrontation, whether by way of observation or by way of action. That is, it is not the being present at hand together of a subject and an object. Nevertheless, it must still have seemed that being in the world has the function of a rigid framework, within which Dasein's possible ways of comporting itself towards its world run their course without touching the framework itself as regards its being. But this supposed framework itself helps make up the kind of being which is Dasein's. An existential mode of being in the world is documented in the phenomenon of falling. Idle talk discloses to Dasein a being towards its world, towards others, and towards itself, a being in which these are understood, but in a mode of groundless floating. Curiosity discloses everything and anything, yet in such a way that being in is everywhere and nowhere. Ambiguity hides nothing from Dasein's understanding, but only in order that being in the world should be suppressed in this uprooted everywhere and nowhere. By elucidating ontologically the kind of being belonging to everyday being in the world, as it shows through in these phenomena, we first arrive at an existentially adequate determination of Dasein's basic state. Which is the structure that shows us the movement of falling? Idle talk and the way things have been publicly interpreted, which idle talk includes, constitute themselves in being with one another. Idle talk is not something present at hand for itself within the world, as a product detached from being with one another. And it is just as far from letting itself be volatilized to something universal which, because it belongs essentially to nobody, is really nothing and occurs as real only in the individual Dasein which speaks. Idle talk is the kind of being that belongs to being with one another itself. It does not first arise through certain circumstances which have effects upon Dasein from outside. But if Dasein itself, in idle talk and in the way things have been publicly interpreted, presents to itself the possibility of losing itself in the they and falling into groundlessness, this tells us that Dasein prepares for itself a constant temptation towards falling. Being in the world is in itself tempting, versucherisch. Since the way in which things have been publicly interpreted has already become a temptation to itself in this manner, it holds Dasein fast in its fallenness. Idle talk and ambiguity, having seen everything, having understood everything, develop the supposition that Dasein's disclosedness, which is so available and so prevalent, can guarantee to Dasein that all the possibilities of its being will be secure, genuine, and full. Through the self-certainty and decidedness of the they, it gets spread abroad increasingly that there is no need of authentic understanding, or the state of mind that goes with it. The supposition of the they, that one is leading and sustaining a full and genuine life, brings Dasein a tranquillity for which everything is in the best of order, and all doors are open. Falling, being in the world which tempts itself, is at the same time tranquilizing, beruhigend. However, this tranquility in inauthentic being does not seduce one into stagnation and inactivity, but drives one into uninhibited hustle, Betriebs. Being fallen into the world does not now somehow come to rest. The tempting tranquilization aggravates the falling. With special regard to the interpretation of Dasein, the opinion may now arise that understanding the most alien cultures and synthesizing them with one's own may lead to Dasein's becoming for the first time thoroughly and genuinely enlightened about itself. Versatile curiosity and restlessly knowing it all masquerade as a universal understanding of Dasein. But at bottom it remains indefinite what is really to be understood, and the question has not even been asked. Nor has it been understood that understanding itself is a potentiality for being which must be made free in one's ownmost Dasein alone. When Dasein, tranquilized and understanding everything, thus compares itself with everything, it drifts along towards an alienation, Entfremdung, in which its ownmost potentiality for being is hidden from it. Falling being in the world is not only tempting and tranquilizing, it is at the same time alienating. Yet this alienation cannot mean that Dasein gets factically torn away from itself. On the contrary, this alienation drives it into a kind of being which borders on the most exaggerated self-dissection, tempting itself with all possibilities of explanation, so that the very characterologies and typologies which it has brought about are themselves already becoming something that cannot be surveyed at a glance. This alienation closes off from Dasein its authenticity and possibility, even if only the possibility of genuinely foundering. It does not, however, surrender Dasein to an entity which Dasein itself is not, but forces it into its inauthenticity, into a possible kind of being of itself. The alienation of falling, at once tempting and tranquilizing, leads by its own movement to Dasein's getting entangled, verfängt in itself. The phenomena that we have pointed out, temptation, tranquilizing, alienation, and self-entangling, entanglement, characterize the specific kind of being which belongs to falling. This movement of Dasein in its own being we call its downward plunge, Absturz. Dasein plunges out of itself, into the groundlessness and nullity of inauthentic everydayness. But this plunge remains hidden from Dasein by the way things have been publicly interpreted, so much so indeed that it gets interpreted as a way of ascending and living concretely. This downward plunge into and within the groundlessness of the inauthentic being of the they has a kind of motion which constantly tears the understanding away from the projecting of authentic possibilities, and into the tranquilized supposition that it possesses everything, or that everything is within its reach. Since the understanding is thus constantly torn away from authenticity and into the they, though always with a sham of authenticity, the movement of falling is characterized by turbulence, Wirbel. Falling is not only existentially determinative for being in the world. At the same time, turbulence makes manifest that the thrownness which can obtrude itself upon Dasein in its state of mind has the character of throwing and movement. Thrownness is neither a fact that is finished, nor a fact that is settled. Dasein's facticity is such that as long as it is what it is, Dasein remains in the throw, and is sucked into the turbulence of the they's inauthenticity. Thrownness, in which facticity lets itself be seen phenomenally, belongs to Dasein, for which, in its being, that very being is an issue. Dasein exists, factically. But now that falling has been exhibited, have we not set forth a phenomenon which speaks directly against the definition we have used in indicating the formal idea of existence? Can Dasein be conceived as an entity for which, in its being, its potentiality for being is an issue, if this entity, in its very everydayness, has lost itself, and, in falling, lives away from itself? But falling into the world would be phenomenal evidence against the existentiality of Dasein only if Dasein were regarded as an isolated I or subject, as a self-point from which it moves away. In that case, the world would be an object. Falling into the world would then have to be reinterpreted ontologically as being present at hand, in the manner of an entity within the world. If, however, we keep in mind that Dasein's being is in the state of being in the world, as we have already pointed out, then it becomes manifest that falling, as a kind of being of this being in, affords us rather the most elemental evidence for Dasein's existentiality. In falling, nothing other than our potentiality for being in world is the issue, even if in the mode of inauthenticity. Dasein can fall only because, being in the world, understandingly with a state of mind, is an issue for it. On the other hand, authentic existence is not something which floats above falling everydayness. Existentially, it is only a modified way in which such everydayness is seized upon. The phenomenon of falling does not give us something like a night view of Dasein, a property which occurs ontically and may serve to round out the innocuous aspects of this entity. Falling reveals an essential ontological structure of Dasein itself. Far from determining its nocturnal side, it constitutes all Dasein's days in their everydayness. It follows that our existential ontological interpretation makes no ontical assertion about the corruption of human nature, not because the necessary evidence is lacking, but because the problematic of this interpretation is prior to any assertion about corruption or incorruption. Falling is conceived ontologically as a kind of motion. Ontically, we have not decided whether man is drunk with sin, and in the status corruptionis, state of corruption, whether he walks in the status integritatis, state of wholeness, the state of humans before the fall, or whether he finds himself in an intermediate stage, the status gratiae, state of grace. But insofar as any faith or world view makes any such assertions, and if it asserts anything about Dasein as being in the world, it must come back to the existential structures which we have set forth, provided that its assertions are to make a claim to conceptual understanding. The leading question of this chapter has been about the being of the there. Our theme has been the ontological constitution of the disclosedness, which essentially belongs to Dasein. The being of that disclosedness is constituted by states of mind, understanding, and discourse. Its everyday kind of being is characterized by idle talk, curiosity, and ambiguity. These show us the movement of falling, with temptation, tranquilizing, alienation, and entanglement as its essential characteristics. But with this analysis, the whole existential constitution of Dasein has been laid bare in its principal features, and we have obtained the phenomenal ground for a comprehensive interpretation of Dasein's being as care. As care. As care. Chapter 6. Care as the being of Dasein. Section 39. The question of the primordial totality of Dasein's structural whole. Being in the world is a structure which is primordially and constantly whole. In the preceding chapters, Division 1, chapters 2 to 5, this structure has been elucidated phenomenally as a whole, and also in its constitutive items, though always on this basis. The preliminary glance which we gave to the whole of this phenomenon in the beginning has now lost the emptiness of our first general sketch of it. To be sure, the constitution of the structural whole and its everyday kind of being is phenomenally so manifold that it can easily obstruct our looking at the whole as such phenomenologically in a way which is unified. But we may look at it more freely, and our unified view of it may be held in readiness more securely if we now raise the question towards which we have been working in our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein in general. How is the totality of that structural whole which we have pointed out to be defined in an existential ontological manner? Dasein exists factically. We shall inquire whether existentiality and facticity have an ontological unity, or whether facticity belongs essentially to existentiality. Because Dasein essentially has a state of mind belonging to it, Dasein has a kind of being in which it is brought before itself and becomes disclosed to itself in its thrownness. But thrownness, as a kind of being, belongs to an entity which in each case is its possibilities, and is them in such a way that it understands itself in these possibilities and in terms of them, projecting itself upon them. Being alongside, the ready to hand, belongs just as primordially to being in the world as does being with others. And being in the world is in each case for the sake of itself. The self, however, is proximally and for the most part inauthentic, the they-self. Being in the world is always fallen. Accordingly, Dasein's average everydayness can be defined as being in the world which is falling and disclosed, thrown and projecting, and for which its ownmost potentiality for being is an issue, both in its being alongside the world and in its being with others. Can we succeed in grasping this structural whole of Dasein's everydayness in its totality? Can Dasein's being be brought out in such a unitary manner that in terms of it, the essential equiprimordiality of the structures we have pointed out, as well as their existential possibilities of modification, will become intelligible? Does our present approach via the existential analytic provide us an avenue for arriving at this being phenomenally? To put it negatively, it is beyond question that the totality of the structural whole is not to be reached by building it up out of elements. For this we would need an architect's plan. The being of Dasein, upon which the structural whole as such is ontologically supported, becomes accessible to us when we look all the way through this whole to a single, primordially unitary phenomenon, which is already in this whole in such a way that it provides the ontological foundation for each structural item in its structural possibility. Thus we cannot interpret this comprehensively by a process of gathering up what we have hitherto gained and taking it all together. The question of Dasein's basic existential character is essentially different from that of the being of something present at hand. Our everyday environmental experiencing, erfahren, which remains directed both ontically and ontologically towards entities within the world, is not the sort of thing which can present Dasein in an ontically primordial manner for ontological analysis. Similarly, our immanent perception of experiences, Erlebnissen, fails to provide a clue which is ontologically adequate. On the other hand, Dasein's being is not to be deduced from an idea of man. Does the interpretation of Dasein, which we have hitherto given, permit us to infer what Dasein, from its own standpoint, demands as the only appropriate ontico-ontological way of access to itself? An understanding of being belongs to Dasein's ontological structure. As something that is, seiend, it is disclosed to itself in its being. The kind of being which belongs to this disclosedness is constituted by state of mind and understanding. Is there in Dasein an understanding state of mind in which Dasein has been disclosed to itself in some distinctive way? If the existential analytic of Dasein is to retain clarity in principle as to its function in fundamental ontology, then in order to master its provisional task of exhibiting Dasein's being, it must seek for one of the most far-reaching and most primordial possibilities of disclosure, one that lies in Dasein itself. The way of disclosure in which Dasein brings itself before itself must be such that in it Dasein becomes accessible as simplified in a certain manner. With what is thus disclosed, the structural totality of the being we seek must then come to light in an elemental way. As a state of mind which will satisfy these methodological requirements, the phenomenon of anxiety will be made basic for our analysis. In working out this basic state of mind and characterizing ontologically what is disclosed in it as such, we shall take the phenomenon of falling as our point of departure, and distinguish anxiety from the kindred phenomenon of fear, which we have analyzed earlier. As one of Dasein's possibilities of being, anxiety, together with Dasein itself, as disclosed in it, provides the phenomenal basis for explicitly grasping Dasein's primordial totality of being. Dasein's being reveals itself as care. If we are to work out this basic existential phenomenon, we must distinguish it from phenomena which might be proximally identified with care, such as will, wish, addiction, and urge. Care cannot be derived from these, since they themselves are founded upon it. Like every ontological analysis, the ontological interpretation of Dasein as care, with whatever we may gain from such an interpretation, lies far from what is accessible to the pre-ontological understanding of being, or even to our ontical acquaintance with entities. It is not surprising that when the common understanding has regard to that with which it is only ontical familiarity, that which is known ontologically seems rather strange to it. In spite of this, even the ontical approach with which we have tried to interpret Dasein ontologically as care may appear far-fetched and theoretically contrived, to say nothing of the act of violence one might discern in our setting aside the confirmed traditional definition of man. Accordingly, our existential interpretation of Dasein as care requires pre-ontological confirmation. This lies in demonstrating that no sooner has Dasein expressed anything about itself to itself than it has already interpreted itself as care, cura, even though it has done so only pre-ontologically. The analytic of Dasein, which is proceeding towards the phenomenon of care, is to prepare the way for the problematic of fundamental ontology, the question of the meaning of being in general. In order that we may turn our glance explicitly upon this in the light of what we have gained, and go beyond the special task of an existentially a priori anthropology, we must look back and get a more penetrating grasp of the phenomena which are most intimately connected with our leading question, the question of being. These phenomena are those very ways of being which we have been hitherto explaining, readiness to hand and presence at hand, as attributes of entities within the world whose character is not that of Dasein. Because the ontological problematic of being has heretofore been understood primarily in the sense of presence at hand, reality, world actuality, while the nature of Dasein's being has remained ontologically undetermined, we need to discuss the ontological interconnections of care, worldhood, readiness to hand, and presence at hand, reality. This will lead to a more precise characterization of the concept of reality in the context of a discussion of the epistemological questions oriented by this idea which have been raised in realism and idealism. Entities are, quite independently of the experience by which they are disclosed, the acquaintance in which they are discovered, and the grasping in which their nature is ascertained. But being is only in the understanding of those entities to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs. Hence being can be something unconceptualized, but it never completely fails to be understood. In ontological problematics, being and truth have, from time immemorial, been brought together, if not entirely identified. This is evidence that there is a necessary connection between being and understanding, even if it may perhaps be hidden in its primordial grounds. If we are to give an adequate preparation for the question of being, the phenomenon of truth must be ontologically clarified. This will be accomplished in the first instance on the basis of what we have gained in our foregoing interpretation, in connection with the phenomena of disclosedness and discoveredness, interpretation and assertion. Thus our preparatory fundamental analysis of Dasein will conclude with the following themes: the basic state of mind of anxiety as a distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed. Section 40. Dasein's being as care. Section 41. The confirmation of the existential interpretation of Dasein as care in terms of Dasein's pre-ontological way of interpreting itself. Section 42. Dasein, worldhood and reality. Section 43. Dasein, discloseness and truth. Section 44. 4. Section 40. The basic state of mind of anxiety is a distinctive way in which Dasein is disclosed. One of Dasein's possibilities of being is to give us ontical information about Dasein itself as an entity. Such information is possible only in that disclosedness which belongs to Dasein and which is grounded in state of mind, an understanding. How far is anxiety a state of mind which is distinctive? How is it that in anxiety Dasein gets brought before itself through its own being, so that we can define phenomenologically the character of the entity disclosed in anxiety, and define it as such in its being, or make adequate preparations for doing so? Since our aim is to proceed towards the being of the totality of the structural whole, we shall take as our point of departure the concrete analyses of falling which we have just carried through. Dasein's absorption in the they, and its absorption in the world of its concern, make manifest something like a fleeing of Dasein in the face of itself as an authentic potentiality for being its self. This phenomenon of Dasein's fleeing in the face of itself and in the face of its authenticity seems at least a suitable phenomenal basis for the following investigation. But to bring itself face to face with itself is precisely what Dasein does not do when it thus flees. It turns away from itself in accordance with its ownmost inertia, Zug, of falling. In investigating such phenomena, however, we must be careful not to confuse ontico-existential characterization with ontologico-existential interpretation, nor may we overlook the positive phenomenal bases provided for this interpretation by such a characterization. From an existential point of view, the authenticity of being oneself has of course been closed off and thrust aside in falling. But to be thus closed off is merely the privation of a disclosedness which manifests itself phenomenally in the fact that Dasein's fleeing is a fleeing in the face of itself. That in the face of which Dasein flees is precisely what Dasein comes up behind. Only to the extent that Dasein has been brought before itself in an ontologically essential manner, through whatever disclosedness belongs to it, can it flee in the face of that in the face of which it flees. To be sure, that in the face of which it flees is not grasped in thus turning away, Abkehr, in falling, nor is it experienced even in turning thither, Hinkehr. Rather, in turning away from it, it is disclosed there. This existential ontical turning away, by reason of its character as a disclosure, makes it phenomenally possible to grasp existential ontologically, that in the face of which Dasein flees, and to grasp it as such. Within the ontical away from which such turning away implies, that in the face of which Dasein flees can be understood and conceptualized by turning thither, in a way which is phenomenologically interpretative. So in orienting our analysis by the phenomenon of falling, we are not in principle condemned to be without any prospect of learning something ontologically about the design disclosed in that phenomenon. On the contrary, here, least of all, has our interpretation been surrendered to an artificial way in which Dasein grasps itself. It merely carries out the explication of what Dasein itself ontically discloses. The possibility of proceeding towards Dasein's being by going along with it and following it up, mit und nachgehen, interpretatively with an understanding and the state of mind that goes with it, is the greater, the more primordial is that phenomenon which functions methodologically as a disclosive state of mind. It might be contended that anxiety performs some such function. We're not entirely unprepared for the analysis of anxiety. Of course, it still remains obscure how this is connected ontologically with fear. Obviously, these are kindred phenomena. This is betokened by the fact that for the most part they have not been distinguished from one another. That which is fear gets designated as anxiety, while that which has the character of anxiety gets called fear. We shall try to proceed towards the phenomenon of anxiety step by step. Dasein's falling into the they and the world of its concern is what we have called a fleeing in the face of itself. But one is not necessarily fleeing whenever one shrinks back in the face of something or turns away from it. Shrinking back in the face of what fear discloses, in the face of something threatening, is founded upon fear, and this shrinking back has the character of fleeing. Our interpretation of fear as a state of mind has shown that, in each case, that in the face of which we fear is a detrimental entity within the world which comes from some definite region, but is close by and is bringing itself close, and yet might stay away. In falling, Dasein turns away from itself. That in the face of which it thus shrinks back must, in any case, be an entity with a character of threatening. Yet this entity has the same kind of being as the one that shrinks back. It is Dasein itself. That in the face of which it thus shrinks back cannot be taken as something fearsome, for anything fearsome is always encountered as an entity within the world. The only threatening which can be fearsome and which gets discovered in fear always comes from entities within the world. Thus, the turning away of falling is not a fleeing that is founded upon a fear of entities within the world. Fleeing that is so grounded is still less a character of this turning away, when what this turning away does is precisely to turn thither, towards entities within the world, by absorbing itself in them. The turning away of falling is grounded rather in anxiety, which in turn is what first makes fear possible. To understand this talk about Dasein's fleeing in the face of itself in falling, we must recall that being in the world is a basic state of Dasein. That in the face of which one has anxiety, das wovor der Angst, is being in the world as such. What is the difference phenomenally between that in the face of which anxiety is anxious, sich ängstet, and that in the face of which fear is afraid? That in the face of which one has anxiety is not an entity within the world. Thus it is essentially incapable of having an involvement. This threatening does not have the character of a definite detrimentality which reaches what is threatened, and which reaches it with definite regard to a special factical potentiality for being. That in the face of which one is anxious is completely indefinite. Not only does this indefiniteness leave factically undecided which entity within the world is threatening us, but it also tells us that entities within the world are not relevant at all. Nothing which is ready to hand or present at hand within the world functions as that in the face of which anxiety is anxious. Here the totality of involvements of the ready-to-hand and the present-at-hand discovered within the world is as such of no consequence. It collapses into itself. The world has the character of completely lacking significance. In anxiety one does not encounter this thing or that thing which, as something threatening, must have an involvement. Accordingly, when something threatening brings itself close, anxiety does not see any definite here or yonder from which it comes. That in the face of which one has anxiety is characterized by the fact that what threatens is nowhere. Anxiety does not know what that in the face of which it is anxious is. Nowhere, however, does not signify nothing. This is where any region lies, and there too lies any discloseness of the world for essentially spatial being in. Therefore that which threatens cannot bring itself close from a definite direction within what is close by. It is already there, and yet nowhere. It is so close that it is oppressive and stifles one's breath, and yet it is nowhere. In that in the face of which one has anxiety, the it is nothing and nowhere becomes manifest. The obstinacy of the nothing and nowhere within the world means as a phenomenon that the world as such is that in the face of which one has anxiety. the utter insignificance which makes itself known in the nothing and nowhere, does not signify that the world is absent, but tells us that entities within the world are of so little importance in themselves that on the basis of this insignificance of what is within the world in its worldhood is all that still obtrudes itself. What oppresses us is not this or that, nor is it the summation of everything present at hand. It is rather the possibility of the ready-to-hand in general. That is to say, it is the world itself. When anxiety has subsided, then, in our everyday way of talking, we're accustomed to say that it was really nothing, and what it was indeed does get reached ontically by such a way of talking. Everyday discourse tends towards concerning itself with the ready-to-hand and talking about it. That in the face of which anxiety is anxious is nothing ready-to-hand within the world. But this nothing ready-to-hand, which only our everyday circumspective discourse understands, is not totally nothing. The nothing of readiness to hand is grounded in the most primordial something, in the world. Ontologically, however, the world belongs essentially to Dasein's being as being in the world. So if the nothing, that is, the world as such, exhibits itself as that in the face of which one has anxiety, this means that being in the world itself is that in the face of which anxiety is anxious. Being anxious discloses primordially and directly the world as world. It is not the case, say, that the world first gets thought of by deliberating about it just by itself, without regard for the entities within the world, and that in the face of this world anxiety then arises. What is rather the case is that the world as world is disclosed first and foremost by anxiety as a mode of state of mind. This does not signify, however, that in anxiety the worldhood of the world gets conceptualized. Anxiety is not only anxiety in the face of something, but as a state of mind it is also anxiety about something. That which anxiety is profoundly anxious, sich abängstet about, is not a definite kind of being for Dasein or a definite possibility for it. Indeed, the threat itself is indefinite, and therefore cannot penetrate threateningly to this or that factically concrete potentiality for being. That which anxiety is anxious about is being in the world itself. In anxiety, what is environmentally ready to hand sinks away, and so, in general, do entities within the world. The world can offer nothing more, and neither can the Dasein with of others. Anxiety thus takes away from Dasein the possibility of understanding itself, as it falls in terms of the world, and the way things have been publicly interpreted. Anxiety throws Dasein back upon that which it is anxious about, its authentic potentiality for being in the world. Anxiety individualizes Dasein for its ownmost being in the world, which, as something that understands, projects itself essentially upon possibilities. Therefore, with that which it is anxious about, anxiety discloses Dasein as being possible. Therefore, with that which it is anxious about, anxiety discloses Dasein as being possible, and indeed as the only kind of thing which it can be of its own accord, as something individualized in individualization, Vereinzeltes in der Vereinzelung. Anxiety makes manifest in Dasein its being towards its ownmost potentiality for being, that is, its being free for the freedom of choosing itself and taking hold of itself. Anxiety brings Dasein face to face with its being free for, propensio in, the authenticity of its being, and for this authenticity as a possibility which it always is. But at the same time, this is the being to which Dasein, as being in the world, has been delivered over. That about which anxiety is anxious reveals itself as that in the face of which it is anxious, namely being in the world. The self-sameness of that in the face of which and that about which one has anxiety extends even to anxiousness, sich ängsten, itself. For, as a state of mind, anxiousness is a basic kind of being in the world. Here, the disclosure and the disclosed are existentially self-same in such a way that in the latter the world has been disclosed as world, and being in has been disclosed as a potentiality for being, which is individualized, pure, and thrown. This makes it plain that with the phenomenon of anxiety, a distinctive state of mind has become a theme for interpretation. Anxiety individualizes Dasein and thus discloses it as solus ipse, itself alone. But this existential solipsism is so far from the displacement of putting an isolated subject thing into the innocuous emptiness of a worldless occurring, that in an extreme sense what it does is precisely to bring Dasein face to face with its world as world, and thus bring it face to face with itself as being in the world. Again, everyday discourse and the everyday interpretation of Dasein furnish our most unbiased evidence that anxiety as a basic state of mind is disclosive in the manner we have shown. As we have said earlier, a state of mind makes manifest how one is. In anxiety one feels uncanny. Here the peculiar indefiniteness of that which Dasein finds itself alongside in anxiety comes proximally to expression. The nothing and nowhere. But here uncanniness also means not being at home, das nicht zu Hause sein. In our first indication of the phenomenal character of Dasein's basic state, and in our clarification of the existential meaning of being in, as distinguished from the categorical signification of insideness, being in was defined as residing alongside, being familiar with. This character of being in was then brought to view more concretely through the everyday publicness of the they, which brings tranquilized self-assurance, being at home with all its obviousness, into the average everydayness of Dasein. On the other hand, as Dasein falls, anxiety brings it back from its absorption in the world. Everyday familiarity collapses. Dasein has been individualized, but individualized as being in the world. Being in enters into the existential mode of the not at home. Nothing else is meant by our talk about uncanniness. By this time we can see phenomenally what falling as fleeing flees in the face of. It does not flee in the face of entities within the world. It does not flee in the face of entities within the world. These are precisely what it flees towards, as entities alongside which our concern, lost in the they, can dwell in tranquilized familiarity. When in falling we flee into the at-home of publicness, we flee in the face of the not at home. That is, we flee in the face of the uncanniness which lies in Dasein. In Dasein as thrown being in the world, which has been delivered over to itself in its being. This uncanniness pursues Dasein constantly and is a threat to its everyday lostness in the they, though not explicitly. This threat can go together factically with complete assurance and self-sufficiency in one's everyday concern. Anxiety can arise in the most innocuous situations, nor does it have any need for darkness, in which it is commonly easier for one to feel uncanny. In the dark there is emphatically nothing to see, though the very world itself is still there, and there more obtrusively. If we interpret Dasein's uncanniness from an existential ontological point of view, as a threat which reaches Dasein itself and which comes from Dasein itself, we're not contending that in factical anxiety too it has always been understood in this sense. When Dasein understands uncanniness in the everyday manner, it does so by turning away from it in falling. In this turning away, the not at home gets dimmed down. Yet the everydayness of this fleeing shows phenomenally that anxiety as a basic state of mind belongs to Dasein's essential state of being in the world, which, as one that is existential, is never present at hand but is itself always in a mode of factical being there, that is, in the mode of a state of mind. That kind of being in the world which is tranquilized and familiar is a mode of Dasein's uncanniness, not the reverse. From an existential ontological point of view, the not at home must be conceived as the more primordial phenomenon. And only because anxiety is always latent in being in the world can such being in the world as being, which is alongside the world, and which is concernful in its state of mind, ever be afraid. Fear is anxiety, fallen into the world, inauthentic and as such hidden from itself. After all, the mood of uncanniness remains, factically, something for which we mostly have no existential understanding. Moreover, under the ascendancy of falling and publicness, real anxiety is rare. Anxiety is often conditioned by physiological factors. This fact, in its facticity, is a problem ontologically, not merely with regard to its ontical causation and course of development. Only because Dasein is anxious in the very depths of its being does it become possible for anxiety to be elicited physiologically. Even rarer than the existential fact of real anxiety are attempts to interpret this phenomenon according to the principles of its existential ontological constitution and function. The reasons for this lie partly in the general neglect of the existential analytic of Dasein, but more particularly in a failure to recognize the phenomenon of state of mind. Yet the factical rarity of anxiety as a phenomenon cannot deprive it of its fitness to take over a methodological function in principle for the existential analytic. On the contrary, the rarity of the phenomenon is an index that Dasein, which for the most part remains concealed from itself in its authenticity because of the way in which things have been publicly interpreted by the they, becomes disclosable in a primordial sense in this basic state of mind. Of course, it is essential to every state of mind that in each case being in the world should be fully disclosed, in all those items which are constitutive for it, world being in self. But in anxiety there lies the possibility of a disclosure which is quite distinctive, for anxiety individualizes. This individualization brings Dasein back from its falling, and makes manifest to it that authenticity and inauthenticity are possibilities of its being. These basic possibilities of Dasein, and Dasein is in each case mine, show themselves in anxiety as they are in themselves, undisguised by entities within the world to which, proximally and for the most part, Dasein clings. How far has this existential interpretation of anxiety arrived at a phenomenal basis for answering the guiding question of the being of the totality of Dasein's structural whole?